conversation with Trevor Gureckis. We at the Center for Language, Music, and Emotion, CLaME. So CLaME is a collaborative center. It's a collaboration between the Max Planck Institute for Empirical Aesthetics, based in Frankfurt, and New York University's various departments that do research in these topical areas. As part of this center, we hold many events that are focused on questions, topics of interest at the intersection of language, music, and emotion. And today we're talking with Trevor Gureckis, an award-winning composer and music producer based in New York City, who will be talking about his work in composing music for film primarily, and this is clearly a question that sits squarely at the intersection of questions of language, music, and emotion. And so several CLaME members and affiliates are here today. So I'm Catherine Hartley. I'm the co-director on the New York side of the Center for Language, Music, and Emotion. I do research on emotion, learning, memory, and decision-making.
Excellent. And I'm Dana Bevilacqua. I'm the research coordinator for CLaME. Just wanted to say thank you, Trevor, for joining us today as well. Very excited for our conversation.
I'm Claire Pelofi. I'm a research scientist for CLaME, and I work in music cognition and perception. And I'm also very happy to be having this conversation today.
Hi, Trevor. Thank you for joining us. I'm David Poeppel. I'm one of the co-directors of the CLaME Center, and my own work is primarily on the brain basis of language processing, language comprehension. And I'm increasingly excited to focus on aspects of music, perception, and cognition.
Hello, my name is Pablo Ripolles. I am a CLaME affiliate, and my research is at the intersection between music and reward. And I'm also really excited to be here to talk with you, Trevor. Thank you so much.
Maybe we can start the conversation by having you tell us a little bit about your background in music, your training.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I mean, when I first heard about this, actually through my brother, I felt this was such an interesting program and interesting study, and it really got me thinking about what I do and how it relates to not only what you guys study, but also just as a practice and practical practice that I do myself. My background is in classical music. I studied piano, classical piano in undergrad at University of Texas in Austin. And then I went to Yale for my master's degree in composition. And I fully was like on the track of mine to, get a degree or become a classical composer and write music for, operas and symphonies. And that was sort of the idea, I think, which is often, the academic route. And be a professor at a university. But I was working for Philip Glass for a number of years, and I kind of saw what he was doing, which was kind of doing some of that, or a substantial amount of that, but also music for film and advertising, and that kind of opened my mind to the idea that there's ways to apply music to a lot of different things, and then I was working with another composer, Jay Wadley, also, a really successful film composer. He just did a score for Charlie Kaufman's I'm Thinking of Ending Things. And he and I have founded a company called Found Objects that we have in Dumbo, Brooklyn, where I am right now. And we just sort of slowly put this together, but, all the while, continuing our film music careers. It's sort of like you follow what your path is based on what's in front of you. So you don't really know. So I started thinking I'm going to be this particular kind of composer, and then I kind of like went in this direction. And it's in that way, there's a kind of a practicality of following, your what's there, and then applying yourself and your skill set to what's in front of you. And it's been an interesting learning experience. The more I do it, as you kind of learn how to, through practice, apply your skill set. I'm getting really practical here because I know that you guys study this, so I guess I'm getting into that mind. But think in that way, because I'm collaborating with people. It's not just me writing a symphony. I'm actually working with someone else. So there's a lot of push and pull of concepts going on.
So what does it mean? So when you were in graduate school, you presumably learn a lot of just kind of nuts and bolts of composition, instrumentation, orchestration, or the sort of toolbox. And what does it mean then? You then worked for a bunch of years for Philip Glass. So what does it actually mean from a nuts and bolts of point of view to work for another composer? What do you actually do? What's a typical day like?
In a way, it's really. I think he described it as just keeping composers off the street. So it's like anything from just going to his house and picking up scores and bringing them to the studio, and I would transcribe it. He writes everything by hand. He's 86 or 87 now, so everything needed to be digital. So I transcribe his very particular handwriting. Or doing like MIDI mock-ups, which is sort of like taking a score and making it an audio rendition with an orchestra, and so that a director, or if it was an advertising project, so that creative team could hear what it would sound like once we record it with a live orchestra, to get the preview before they invest the money that goes into actually doing the whole thing. So it's sort of like a catch-all. And then I would, from that I would go to the recording session and lead the orchestra and finalize the recording. So, you go through the whole process and learn. You go from Philip's, watching him create his ideas, taking it, to the end. And on occasion I would kind of help a little bit on arrangement if there was like some edges that needed finalizing, and generally he was kind of like, you do whatever needs to get across the finish line. I go back to my opera, because really his passion was opera. I think he's written like 22 or 20, so, something like, and symphonies, and these were things that were important to him, but also paid the bills. So so I learned a lot about just how to get things done, which was really valuable.
I believe he also composed music for films himself. And if I'm right, you actually interpreted one of this song for piano in a movie called The Stalker. Is that correct?
Yeah.
I was wondering, to which extent do you think your path towards the movie and television industry right now has been guided by his example, or has been hinted by his advices in any ways, or not at all?
No, not at all. No, actually, I was a huge fan of his since even high school. So I knew all of his scores and all of his albums and everything. So working for him was great. And, and then seeing it up close, I could see what he was doing. And he has his style of music, of course, which is completely recognizable. And if there's any composer who has like a very direct point of view, or like a sound, that's Philip Glass. And you kind of know where well, it was funny enough, people were surprised sometimes what they got from him. But what I think about his music for film, especially with like his work with Errol Morris on documentaries and stuff. He's always great at coming up with this like distance from the picture, a little bit of a sense of constant sense of melancholy, or I think even Errol Morris called it existential dread, and it's this strange space that that I always found really interesting. And when I was seeing it up close, I kind of saw what he was doing and kind of watching. I think it became natural by the time I was around, but it was certainly something that he had developed. And in Stoker, that was a score that he was actually hired to compose the entire score, but then he didn't end up doing the whole score, but they kept the piece that was in the movie, and that was one that I played with my wife. We both performed it, and then the actors faked it, and then they had some hand doubles and stuff. And actually what we did is videotaped ourselves so that the cinematographer, we had like a bunch of, just at home, just like videotapes and various takes of it. The cinematographer would like use our performance, so they would use to inspire how they shot the whole scene.
I was wondering, so when you're a student at Yale in composition, do you step out from there with all the tools that you need also to be a movie, a film, musical filmmaker? Or is there things along the way that you had to acquire in terms of synthesizer, electronic music, and this sort of effects? Or is it something that you already learned at Yale, and that's now part of any sort of formation for young composer?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I learned at Yale was basically like how to listen, how to decode what's happening. But that was it. I mean, that's not to say that's nothing, but in terms of like then moving into real world experience, there's just an incredible amount that you need to learn, like computer technology and all of that. So everything else that you listed, I had to it was self-taught.
When you say to decode what's happening, can you say a little more about that? What are you decoding? What are you trying to relate or understand the function of?
Well, I mean, because there's so much score reading, and that's such a huge part of studying composition, referencing, listening to Stravinsky or watching scores while, performance is happening. You get to really look under the hood of like, what is that sound? How is that achieved? But then at Yale, they were also really open to like, anything, like how is anything achieved, So how is and then you can apply that to, a Kanye West song, like how is that beat? Where does that, you just keep applying it over and over again and it can be done, and you just start to get into this mode where your production, your classical decomposing of a sound can be applied to anything. Like you can just kind of think like, what's that snare and how is it, where do you think that came from, or how is it two snares maybe, and which producers do all the time. Like it's not unusual at all, but it's just sort of that's the route that I got there. I mean, other people do it the same way.
Is that automatized? I mean, are you now a fully, let's say, analytic listener, or can you back away from that? I mean, is that so much part of your toolbox that you are overly analytic?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely like a problem where I do struggle listening to music and not. I do have a problem with hearing what's going on and thinking about what's happening, like what instruments are used and what's, what's going on in the music.
You mentioned earlier, as sort of part of your upbringing, that you're helping out to, a very senior musician and composer whose hallmark is, let's say, as a feeling, now turning a little bit to the emotion topic that we're so interested in, of existential dread as an acoustic signature. And so is that something that you were drawn to in film? Or what were you, when you started out as a pianist and presumably writing pieces here or there, did you think of, or were you drawn then to this, compelling expression of emotion? Because that's what you're doing now, right? In your films, and certainly in your work on the show The Servant, which we'll talk about more, it's extremely about eliciting affect.
Yeah.
So something you learned in grad school, or did you come naturally, or is that something that Glass gave you because you had to work with the materials? Because it's not compatible with being an analytic listener, right?
Is it compatible? I don't know. I mean, there are. I feel like if I were to say Philip's music is able to achieve certain things by using, because I'm always in analytic mode, so maybe I'm analyzing it wrong. I mean, someone could be like, no, it just feels that way. And I'm like, okay, well, I can't argue with you because you just said it. So, but I could be like, well, this tone, this harmonic thing kind of functions in this way. And so I kind of feel if I did the similar thing in this scene, at least somewhat similar, because I don't want to sound exactly like Philip Glass, because I don't think it might be the right thing to do. I would be able to kind of get a similar quality from that.
Let me jump in and ask you another related question, because I'm hearing you saying that you can't help yourself from decoding the instruments and what's going on. And now we're talking about emotion, and if I understood what you are saying, you're also kind of saying that you can say, okay, this song or this particular piece is designed to evoke this particular emotion, right? But there is, at least in our line of work, we keep talking about this paradox in which people can objectively identify that a song is meant to be nostalgic or to be sad or to be happy, but that doesn't mean that the person is going to feel that, right? So there is this idea that I can say this is objectively sad, but it's not making me sad, it's not moving me. And I wanted to ask you more about this, also because I'm teaching a class which is called The Psychology of Music, and when it came the moment to talk about the compositional process, everybody was asking me, like, so do composers have like a cheat sheet, like I'm gonna do this and it's going to be sad, and they can be cold and analytical and almost like engineers, or do they need to feel it? Do they need, while they are composing or while they are listening to what they compose, they need to feel the sadness or feel the happiness in order to check that the piece that they are composing has the effect they want? So lots of questions in one, but for me, it's like, how much, when you compose, how much do you act like an engineer or use your own feelings towards what you are composing to create?
I think maybe the engineering part is sort of coming up with the scaffolding. It's maybe what I'm going to write, or thinking of, or starting a piece. Maybe I'll be like, well, this is going to be kind of like the basic parameters, or like I won't think in those kind of, in that language, but I might have a good idea about where that would where it could go, or what that kind of like baseline concept is, and that is like has these kind of rules. It does become a question of whether or not someone actually interprets it that way, for sure. I mean, there's always going to be the intention, and then that doesn't come across. Like, that happens all the time, right? You can't control those things. But I do take that, which I think through experience, I've gotten more successful at being able to kind of know what's, what the setup can provide. Certainly, there's always that opening where people will be like, "No, I thought that was just scary music." You're like, "Well, it's supposed to be like."
So you use both, right? So you're saying that you are using maybe to begin with the composition for the scaffolding, more the engineering part, but then you also use your own feelings and your own experience to check whether what you intend to transmit is there, right? That's super interesting.
You have to, you do have to. There is like at least some greater than 0% things that you could list down, like what makes a sad song, right? Mm-hmm. You have to at least get something, right? Like, so, and that could be instrumentation, violins are something, piano, a soft piano is something, like that's going to elicit something. At least there's like some concept there that you can work from, and then it's about just sort of adjusting. But you have to at least know, or you do know through working and just sort of general experience of listening to other people's music too, because that's a huge part of it, just sort of knowing what works. And
I think there is a very distinctive moments that I found where you use a very interesting scholarly process, I want to say, to create something like that, which is in the Goldfinch, where you have this piano theme in the beginning, and it goes throughout all the film, really, and the music is composed so that there is a sort of unresolved arpeggi that you use for the theme, and then you only resolve it really at the end, at one of the final scenes. Mm-hmm. I was wondering if you would say that, for instance, here you really use like one of the, in the book trick of composers to create a sense of tension that represent this nod that the character is having in it, in himself. That's sort of a result at the end, and it's supported so beautifully by the harmonies in the theme. There's a very good translation of the feeling into the technicalities of the music here, I found.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely some of those undercurrent things that, you put in, you hope they give you some musical guidance as you're writing, because that like you do have like some eventual point, and that's true with the Goldfinch. There is that moment at the end, but it wasn't necessarily. I mean, I wrote the main theme, and then I did write the last cue early on in the process, and eventually knowing that, oh right, I'm going to resolve this suspended chord, and just basically play the suspended chord like through the entire movie, so with the expectation that we're going to get there. But I mean, it's it's sort of like who you really have to hear it and think about it and know what that is to get there. And like some people pick it up, and that's really awesome to know, because when you suspend so long, it's like the question is whether or not tension ever exists anyway. But I mean, I think that getting to that final place, it does reinforce the idea that you've been actually listening to tension, but before you were sitting in tension the whole time.
Most of us don't know how to. I mean, we're not composers, but can you just briefly say a couple of words of just on process for ourselves and potential viewers, and how you go about this just from a practical point of view? So this book existed before, right? So I don't know, do you first read Donna Tartt's novel and then think about it, or do you have scenes that you're working with when you're working with the director of photography or something like that? How do you actually go about structuring your thing when you're making a bigger piece like that?
I mean, with filmmaking, it can be kind of a logistical situation where you're like, I was brought in to audition for the job really quickly, and I had no time to read the massive book that it is. So it was really just sort of like get through the script of what you could, the script is much smaller. So it's like, here's the script, and here's a couple of days, write some music. You're going to be competing with a bunch of other composers that have bigger names. You're a nobody. This was all very directly spoken to me. So it was like, all right, I'll just try and keep going.
So after you are contracted to do the score for the film, are you then watching? Are you watching scenes that have been filmed that are unscored, and you're thinking about, composing music to accompany that scene? Are you working from the script as you move forward? Obviously, in the case of the Goldfinch, you have this, composition that you had used for the audition, but how does the sound of that kind of, or in the case of another project, how do you arrive on what the sort of sound space of a given work is, if that makes sense?
Yeah, so usually with films, the edits of the film are usually pretty far along by the time they start getting a real composer and meaning like live composer rather than just temp music, like music from other scores or whatever. So the edit was pretty far along, and so that was when I was able to start composing. So once I was eventually hired, then it was, although I was writing music for the film before I was hired, and they were just so I was doing additional music. I think I did another 20 minutes of just please hire me music. So I was like, try this scene, write music for that scene. And like, well, then you have to hire him. So it was like convincing music, yeah, so then they eventually, you're like, okay, let's go. And then it's like, all right, let's start over, kind of. I mean, I did have that opening theme, and that theme was sort of like, what is this, I don't know. You have discussions with director John Crowley and about the character Theo and his life and this suspension that he's going through. I mean, there we go. I just applied like a literal suspended cord because I was like, because of this. His life is being uprooted after this terrorist attack at the museum, and he's keeps being pushed around all his life, and I just wanted to have something that just felt unresolved. He's constantly being pushed around, and then something that had like a clear melody. Again, applying like goals and so in that way. But then also because of the painting, I wanted something to have really a high color contrast. I was using a lot of almost impressionistic things. Like there, I'm doing more application driven things. But overall, those are the structures, and then within that, there's a lot of choices that I'm making musically that I find appealing.
You've done 16 different versions of this, and then one of them has the alignment between the technical sophistication and it feels right in the sense of mystery. Are you an emotion universalist? I mean, getting to the, like, this is what I want to know, right?
Yeah.
So do you think that the particular choice you've made, I mean, it happens to resonate with you, do you think it's going to resonate with me or with somebody in a different culture altogether?
I mean, I doubt it. I think like only with the closer you get with people who know what you're doing, the closer they are with projects you work on, I feel like you might connect and it might make sense to them, but how it makes sense to them, on what level, and they explain it back to you. You're kind of like, oh, okay, that's not really what I was thinking I was doing, but I see where you're coming from. And then the more you work with him, like when I work with Knight, like he's really good at like decoding what I'm doing and how wrong it is. So he's able to like, it's not about wrong, but just like able to rejigger what I'm saying, like what I did, and say like, oh, actually, what you should really be focusing on is what she's thinking at this point. And I realized, oh yeah, I wasn't doing that. And that's why that came out. Now, if I did this is going to come out. So in that way, he and I have a long, 2-year relationship on this show, but how does that translate to people who would sit there and like really analyze what we're doing? I don't.
Well, I don't think it's the analysis. I mean, this is, I'm going to pin you down on this. I mean, you think people feel more or less the same things or not, right? So if we take one of your compositions and we play it, in Bali and in, former East Germany and I don't know where, is the presumption that you have as a composer that it broadly elicits the same kind of affect, not other stuff? Or is that something you just don't care about? I mean, it's perfectly, you can say, look, I just don't give a damn. I think it's ridiculous. I mean, the reason I want to know, I'm asking you is because it's one of the deep issues for us.
Right.
And so that's where psychology and neuroscience really split.
Yeah.
Theoretically, experimentally. And so for those of us who worry about this, the extent to which things are, how do we negotiate the tension between stability and plasticity?
Right.
One thing, we want to be sort of stable in an engineering sense, and then we want to allow for the cultural contingencies in the affective sense. And you are like a folk psychologist as a composer, right?
Yeah.
You're bringing this to the task, and I want to know are you bringing this to the world or just to Brooklyn or Dumbo or just your building?
I think if I were to say like I'm clearly restating or I hope I'm not broken record about all this toolkit and scaffolding and stuff. I mean, those things are so particular to Western classical, Western media. How does that translate? I mean, you would have to have that. I feel like you would have to have that experience a little bit to just to know, like, oh yeah, a violin feels a certain way, a little bit. I mean, I'm doing things that work in our like media culture, like so much in what we know, right? With the expectation that you bring to your life and that experience. There's a lot of what I'm doing in detail that might elicit like specific feelings that I might be tasked to do, right? With all these like details of melancholy and turning characters and all this stuff. But if you're just gonna wipe all that away and be like, what's an F minor chord? And that's what I'm doing. And play it for anyone, and they're gonna say, is that a sad chord.
Let's turn a little bit the discussion to one of the things we're sort of that you're actively working on, and then I had the pleasure to watch, which is the TV show The Servant, which is, I guess, one of the executive producers, and the person you're working with most closely is Night Shyamalan. This is right, and so so I've watched a bunch of that show, which is deeply fascinating, and just to continue on this particular line of questioning to annoy you. So I'm a relentless nativist and universalist. I think the operating system of the human brain is what it is. But this is one of the most interesting features of how we work, right? So what is shared between us? And this show is being shown in a bunch of different countries. This I know because at the end there's a little trailer thing that does it in Spanish and in German and in Russian. So it's marketed internationally. And so the sequence of the kind of creepy sounds as you walk to the door, which is sort of slightly open, right, at the beginning.
Yeah.
That's supposed to be, that for me is a kind of creepiness. Now, creepiness is not a category of emotion, but my presumption is that this lead into to every episode with a particular kind of sonic texture that you've provided for it gives the same rough impression to everyone, namely the sort of something mysterious and weird and not exactly positive. You're not like, coming to the, clown at the birthday party or something like that. And so it's that sense of universal that I mean, that I assume you carry with you just automatically as you're composing this material.
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes sense because we're looking for sounds that evokes something. I don't know how they translate to other people. I mean, that sound actually is created using a bass kalimba, and I bow it. So it's not even an instrument that's westernized. It's a Western performance of a. So it's like I'm really messing with the parameters here, but so it creates this when you bow it, it makes this. So it's this crazy noise, right? And
do you have it there? Do you have it in your office there?
Yeah, it's right here. Do you want to see?
Yeah, kind of.
When I bow this, I don't have enough rosin on this, but basically it's like you have to really. But when I'm actually on the ground doing it, if you remember the opening.
That sounds familiar.
Anyway, but that with a lot of effects, So that's a weird sound.
Some films were really associated with the soundtrack so heavily. And in the case of The Servant, one thing that I noticed right away was that the soundtrack was also making the show so charismatic because of the choices that was made in terms of orchestration and the work on timbres, really. So I was very curious to hear about that in particular. How did you make this choice of working with timbres that, to me, really sounded like the work of a scholar-composer rather than the filmmaker? And I was just curious about this choice. Was it something that came from you or from Night? And do you agree that it has such a huge impact on how the show presents itself as so sophisticated?
Yeah, I think there's so many elements of the show that kind of come together, and the score is definitely part of it because it has its own sonic identity, and that's something that he is always interested in looking for. We did kind of a similar thing where I wrote a piece of music and then just off the grid, and we just talked about it. And actually, he edits all of his movies and shows without music at all. to see if they hold together by themselves. So like the first episode I saw ever didn't have any music, and he's like, I don't know if I'm gonna have any music in this at all, just so you know. So just because he wants to make it tight and like that, you know, everything lands right, and you know, so like that's always, because there's always the question of, before a composer comes in, the temp music, other people's music being in there to help with the editor, to do pacing and stuff, and if the director wants to be part of that. But he never likes to hear either my old music or old stuff, because it can be confusing and doesn't sound like what it will eventually be. But so we eventually got to this sonic world by just trying to find sort of you know, the bowing of the frontales and stuff, and that instrument, and I learned violin to do all these weird sounds, and he wanted something that was transparent, and like, because of the house, and I was interested in, you know, Morton Feldman and like these like really, you know, experimental composers, and I felt like they had a kind of a space to them as well. So it kind of came together in that way. And so yeah, having a lot of like organic instruments with some electronics and that balance. And actually, but this season 2 is like, it's getting so much more intense, and so there's a lot more electronic and bigger orchestral elements, but I'm still playing violin and that instrument and creating weird sounds all the time. But
yeah, I was kind of wondering about that, because unlike like an opera or a movie that is like a clear beginning, middle, and end, like this show is now on the third season. You're finished the second season, or
finishing.
Yeah. So that sounds like quite like an evolving process. So to what extent do you have like a sound that you associate with each character, and you're kind of working on those voices as the storyline evolves? Because there's very much like this kind of, for a lot of the characters, it feels like there's a very much a friend or foe question for a lot of it. Like, is this someone you're on the side of or not? So I'm just wondering how you kind of imagine that unfolding.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely plan out like themes and characters, and I certainly kind of push that to help me structure, just because the amount of music is just a lot, so I have to just know what's going to happen. So it's like when I see a scene with Dorothy, I have to have some grounding of what I'm going to do. I can't just keep creating new content, and it is new, but it has to be new within the realm of something, and that's the same with season 2. It's like, it's all kind of a new palette, because we again went through the process of like, what's the sound of season 2, and I wrote new music and new this, and then, so it's like, all right, so we have a bigger style and bigger palette, but we're still in the servant world, and the characters have gone further, and they're bigger, and they're, it's more bold and all that stuff. So but they still have harmonic language that you can trace back to season 1. Like,
so when the palette changes between seasons, what changes? What new elements get in?
It could be like certain electronic instruments that I've been using a lot more in this season, to give it more like low end power. I keep saying the word power because there's a lot more thriller-esque elements in this season. I think the first season was a lot more about like establishing just kind of a strange and unnerving world that was just constantly off kilter, and this one's more about racing to the to something. So But yeah, so coming up with like clear delineations of like whose kind of music is this and whose kind of music is that definitely helps as a guiding principle for writing music for such a long series.
What struck me also in the way the music was composed in this season 1, and maybe that's echoing with what you were just saying about season 2, is that you were able to create a sonic universe that was always had the feeling of being always on the razor. And you said that earlier at some point. You said something like it doesn't have to be too heavy, or it should not be too heavy, depending on what sort of psychological universe it's gonna be illustrating. And this in the season 1, and I don't know about season 2, you won't tell us probably, but in season 1, what's very striking is that it's on the edge between accepting reality and denying it, and there is a psychological fragility that's very at the center of the whole season. Yeah. Spoiler alert. And the music that's very tenuous and fragile illustrate this point of balance and unbalance very, very tightly, very nicely. So is season 2 the recourse of more heavy, maybe themed or instrumentation? Also, do you think it has to do with the psychological state of the characters, or the main way reality is being faced, as opposed to in season 1?
It's similar. There's always that struggle of like what's real and what's not. But there's more of a actionable behavior with people in season 2 that was always kind of like, are you gonna do something in season 1? So and there was always that line constantly. We were always talking about it, like, is it real? Is it not? Is it real or not? It's both. Mm-hmm. Schrodinger's cat. If you look, it's there.
Okay, so we have the opportunity to watch a few clips of the show you're working on right now, Servants. And maybe, Trevor, you can say a little bit about how you actually started working on the show and got into this, and then give us a little bit of the backstory, and then we'll watch a couple of clips and discuss them as we go along.
Yeah, sure. So I just came off this movie called Goldfinch, and the music supervisor for that movie, Sue Jacobs, introduced me to M. Night Shyamalan. And we had a meeting, and I wrote some music, kind of free form off the picture, just sort of to find the sound for the show. I had seen kind of the first episode to get kind of an idea, but and I read most of the scripts. Or of course, they always kept the last episode away from us, so we wouldn't know what happened at the very end. But I thought it was like super interesting and really strange. So like really something I wanted to do, especially coming off of a rather like big Hollywood movie. So this show is about a family that lost their baby, and the mother, who's going through a lot of grief, has a reborn doll, but she's so involved in this that she really does think that this reborn doll is her baby, and the father, Sean, is letting her buy into this and buying into it himself in a way, and she wants to go back to work, so they hire a nanny for this doll. So yes, it kind of starts with this very strange situation where they meet the nanny in the first episode. And the first clip we have is sort of the culmination of some of his experience with that. And he's very dismissive of this nanny because he knows it's just they just hired her for the doll. but she seems to take it very seriously herself, and which is super weird and creepy in itself. So here's the first clip, which I thought was an interesting way of showing just sort of the pacing of the thriller vibe that we wanted to get in the show, which is like delaying the expectations.
Thank you, Mr. Turner.
Take all the time you need. Hit a bar.
Yeah, so, one of the things that we, which is important and something that I learned a lot from working with Night was just really staying in the character's head and not anticipating or being ahead of where their mind is. So that, he's having trouble tasting wine, so he goes to the wine cellar and he hears this like cough or something, but he's not sure. Many times you could have scored at that point and been like, oh, there's something creepy already, but he doesn't really know. So he wasn't, Night did, he always says like getting ahead, you're ahead of me, like he's used that term, so even all the way up to the part where he's upstairs and then then you hear the cough, which makes it all the more unsettling and crazy because you finally, at first it's kind of a cough, is that what it is? And then a real cough. Remember, this is like, all we know is that this was a doll the entire episode. And then like, why are you hearing a cough on the monitor? And then it's finally the music kicks in when he's finally realizing something's up and he like looking up the stairs and goes up and sees, turning around the camera and you see it's a real baby somehow. So I don't know how that happened. So yeah, that's the end of the first episode. The twist.
Before we watch the second clip, because already in this first clip there was yet another creepy food scene. What's up with the food scenes? What's going on there? Why this violence and this sort of, yeah, it's violent actually, right? Everything about the food is violent.
I'm not the writer, but I would say that there's an intensity to it that increases throughout the show. That's my sense of it. Mm-hmm. As Sean is constantly trying to get his taste back, so he gets trying grosser and grosser things and more challenging. For some reason his taste doesn't work, and so he's dealing with that by as a chef, playing with more and more distressing situations. That's my interpretation of that. But I don't think I've ever, we talked about this earlier, but I don't think I've ever scored any of the cooking scenes.
I don't think so, because I started paying attention to it, because it was, and I thought, well, okay, now there's going to be some kind of signature thing, but it was very restrained about that. Just the sounds of actually working with the food itself, which I thought was pretty
cool. Right. Yeah.
So should we watch the next clip?
This is you. Ma'am. Hey, home sweet home?
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Hello? Don't just leave him. Hello. Oh. Hi. Oh, it's okay. It's okay. Did he miss me?
What?
Did he miss me? Did he miss me?
Yeah. Of course.
Oh, are you hungry? You are, aren't you?
Whose is it?
Mr. Turner?
Yeah, so I thought that scene was a interesting example of kind of playing between point of view and capturing a few different moments, because we start with Dorothy in the car, and there's sort of this strange moment where she's suspended. And that's something that's kind of set up a couple of times throughout the show, and I think in this episode as well. It's sort of like, does she know? It's like, does she know something's up? It's constantly like, is she aware that, what's happened, because remember, she still thinks there's a doll, right? So, and then we cut to Sean in the bedroom looking at this is the next episode. So just now we're watching him looking at this now live baby that was a doll in the last episode. There's a couple of just like moments that are hitting along the way that, I wanted to grasp, like gravity and then the release of the dreaminess of that. And the harmonic language in that area is actually related to this Jericho theme stuff, which is the baby, the original baby. So in that way, that was my toolbar. So it was like, I was able to kind of pull that, and then, that gave me some guidance as to where I could, pull some ideas from.
You talked earlier about the idea of using music to sort of direct the viewer's point of view. I felt that in that scene at the point, you have this sort of atmosphere of, that begins in the taxi of sort of like discord or disorientation or something. And then at the point when she enters the room, you don't know what her response is going to be to this now live baby. And at the moment where the piano comes in, you squarely realize that you're in the point of view of the husband, that, the combination of her lack of shock, kind of, there's a, the only coherent perspective between the music and what's happening in the scene is that you're sort of forced into seeing the scene through his lens. Like how much is that as you're composing for that scene, is that what you're trying to do? Or was that sort of a process of, is Knight saying, I want the music to accomplish that, like a recognition that only he is the one who is seeing this situation as disturbing or, unreal?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, it's definitely all from Sean's point of view watching this. And we're not seeing Dorothy walk in and be like, oh, happy to be home with my baby now. Because from her point of view, all we know is that nothing's changed in her life except she's now home and has the baby, right? So like, if I were to score that, it would be a completely different thing, because she would have somewhat more of a relief to be home or something like that. But actually what's going on and the real tension of the scene is that Sean not only tries to stop her because he thinks like, oh wait, you're gonna be shocked by this, but also is realizing that she's just once again not skipping a beat. And
I wanted to say something about this character, Leanne, actually. Leanne is really the one character that has a very double face, and where she sometimes appears like this just innocent, normal young girl that is put in a very strange situation and has to deal with it, and sometimes herself appears as a source of anxiety or abnormality or something threatening. Have you worked around a way to show this ambivalence in the character itself throughout the music that plays along with her?
I mean, she definitely has, connections to. The question is always like, where did she come from? Like, where, even from the beginning, because she buys into this doll that, as if it's the baby from the get-go. So you're already questioning like, who is this person? And as you learn more about her, it becomes clear that she has connections to this cult thing, and then but then she's also very protective of and questions Dorothy and questions all the characters in the show, and is kind of self-righteous and petulant, and she's like a teenager too. So there's like all these kinds of things. So it's like she has some sort of power too, which is also weird. Like she kind of has this like, which kind of comes from the cult thing, or is it not real? There's always that element of like, did they just stub their toe? I don't know. So, with her, I always tried to like, definitely draw the line of some of the dark music that you would associate with that instrument that I played in earlier. That was always kind of like an undercurrent, because that definitely has some like origin to where she came from. But there is also underneath that, there is that character, that kid who wants to be a kid still, or real. She wants to be real or something.
We have the third clip that goes much more to that's now further down the narrative. Let's take a peek at that. And there's some kind of denouement.
Can I borrow you for 5? Unfortunately, blowfish has somewhat of a bad reputation. Contains tetrodotoxin, which is 1,200 times more deadly than cyanide. So when you prepare it, you gotta be extra careful. Make sure you don't nick any of the organs, because if they bleed into the flesh, you could get sick and die. I need to know how it tastes. Describe it for me.
It's sharp. And then bitter.
This is ceviche. Dates back to the Incas. Cooked without heat. And all but physics, it's raw.
I don't like it.
Try again. I need to know why you don't like it.
Why did you stay with her? After what she did.
Because it was an accident. It was a mistake, and people make mistakes, Leanne. She stayed with him for 4 days, just the two of them, waiting for me to come home and help. If I'd been here, none of that would have happened. That was my mistake.
Tastes like bruised fruit. Like an apple that's been in the sun too long.
I honestly thought this one was a interesting scene because it has a lot of narrative hits or narration hits that I had to shape to. Different points that I was harmonically hitting, leading up to some sort of resolution, which is ultimately definitely a sad space.
Now, you've worked on 2 seasons of Servants, but also done a bunch of feature-length things. What's more satisfying as a composer, actually? Is this also a drawn? There's probably a different time horizon and a sense of a kind of musical arc. If you had brothers, what would you do next?
Series are definitely pretty grueling time-wise. They're this is 10 episodes, so there are only 30-minute episodes, but that's still about 18 to 20 minutes of music an episode, and we're doing an episode a week or a week and a half, episode a week and a half. So that's a lot of music to do, to write plus get approved. That doesn't mean that, feature films are any easier necessarily, but they do have an end date that's like after a few months, but these are like long like sequences, like so there is, what's good about it though is that you're a part of something that goes on for hopefully a number of years, which is an interesting journey.
We've asked you a lot about the what your processes and how you work and what your goal is. Do you think, so we work in the context of this research center on, like, for instance, Pablo and Kate work on things like reward, valuation, things. Claire works on things like prediction in music. I work actually occasionally on just sound structure itself. It's a very low level type of stuff. Is there a role for us as scientists, or are we just a kind of orthogonal planet and you don't really give much of a damn?
What I can offer is sort of the on the ground experience of what a composer does, which can be interesting, and there's a lot of practicality. I guess I'm pushing that a lot, but I mean, there is that element which I don't know how information how useful that is.
I think that the extent to which you push the craft aspect of it and the professionalization is very helpful. It demystifies the process from the sort of genius insight into suddenly findings. The fact that there are specific constraints, narrative constraints, point of view constraints, I think is very helpful for us to understand.
Yeah.
And I think you're very good at avoiding the hard questions of emotion, even though that's what you traffic in. That's your main mode of communication when you do film music. It's interesting, right? So it means you have it sort of as a folk psychological theory or an intuitive theory that you deploy, which I think is quite cool. So there is actually a role for us, but the role for us might be in trying to understand how you work.
I think that the stuff that I always you say I try to avoid answering is the stuff that I'm because I have to be such a pragmatist in my job, I can't get so wrapped up about, right? So I can't put a lot of value into even my own thought process into it. That makes sense. If it's rejected, then I can't give a shit. I have to just move on to the next thing, right? If it's like, and the rejection can be on a spectrum, because I think almost everything is a spectrum in the case of music, because it's like, I might, it's like, it's 50%, right? Why can't it be 65% correct? Or, you know what I mean? There's just never this full on, situation where you're just, I'm adding up all the elements that get me almost there, and then I'm just missing this one part. And so the one part that I always seem to avoid is that a little unknown thing, which, bugs me, but at least I'm able to, kind of adjust.
I think it provides us a good contextual ending for a discussion, because rejection is something we understand very well. That is our main thing that we traffic in. We are sympathetic in all aspects of that, for sure. And thank you, Trevor, for all this information. It's great. I think.
Thank you so much, Trevor. We still have 2,000 questions, but now we know who you are, right? So
yeah.
Unfortunately for you, we know where to find you.
I can't wait.
you.